We're very pleased to have the team from the National Center for Accessible Media, or NCAM, here again today. NCAM has worked with our project, the BUAC project, since year one, helping us develop our accessibility strategy and Section 508 strategy, and then guiding us in the development of accessible media for K-12 students. Working with them has been invaluable for us to our larger efforts, so I can't speak highly enough of the team who's with us today. So I will start by introducing today's presenter and then just move right on to NCAM. Madeline Rothberg is here from NCAM. She's led research on access to educational media, health IT, and transit communications. And she helped launch metadata standards for accessibility that are now in use for accessible publications worldwide. Claire Houston is an accessibility analyst with experience in disability advocacy and also technology policy. And she previously interned as a Google Public Policy Fellow at the American Association of People with Disabilities. Finally, Brian Gould has been conducting blindness-related research and development projects for over 20 years at WGBH. For those of you who don't know, NCAM is part of WGBH as well. So in addition to web accessibility, Brian is an expert in writing image description and audio description for video. And just the last note before Madeline takes the presentation away, that at the end we will post a survey at the end of the webinar to get your feedback. And for those of you in the SciAct community, one of the questions we'll ask if you are interested in follow-up one-on-one consultations with NCAM. So if you are, certainly make sure you respond to the survey so we can get back to you and set that up. All right, thank you. And without further ado, I'll pass this to Madeline.
Thank you all for coming today. As Pegeen said, the National Center for Accessible Media is part of the WGBH Educational Foundation, and we're part of the 45-year history of making technology accessible at WGBH. This started with creating the first captioned television, and later we created a service called Descriptive Video Service for people who are blind or visually impaired. And then finally, we created the National Center to do research, consulting, develop new technologies, and work with projects like yours to help you make your digital media more accessible. We also work in standards and help write guidelines for industry and technology, and we're funded through a variety of different kinds of projects. So we thought we'd start by checking in to see who's here. And so we have a poll. What is your role? Educator, instructional designer, visual designer, interaction designer, developer, subject matter expert, event coordinator, or something else? So some of you now see a little poll widget in your screen. And if your technology doesn't allow you to see the poll widget, feel free to just type your answer in the chat from the choices in the list. And this will help us know if we need to give more or less detail in certain areas. It looks like we have a lot of educators and instructional designers here today, and some visual designers, some SMEs and project managers. We love it when project managers have a good sense of the accessibility lifecycle, so that's terrific. Evaluators need to know what to look for, so that's useful too. Terrific, thanks. I think that's enough for this poll. And then next, we thought we would ask what kinds of materials you create. So today is going to be all about creating materials, both print and digital. And we're curious about whether you produce a little of everything, check as many as apply, or whether you don't produce any print, you only produce digital. Looks like we have a pretty good mix, but mostly a lot of interactive and digital stuff. Well, about half of you are still producing print materials regularly, which is interesting. We're going to touch on all of these topics today and give you some resources for all of these areas. Thank you, Ethan, for the poll. So if you were able to join the webinar on Tuesday, you saw some of this material already at the beginning, and we know that some people couldn't come on Tuesday or are new today, so we wanted to at least give a quick take on it. I won't go into a lot of detail about these technology background issues, so if you see something that doesn't make a lot of sense and you'd like more information, I hope that you'll be able to check out the archived webinar. So briefly, accessibility regulations and guidelines you've probably heard about include Section 508 or the Americans with Disabilities Act, things like that. Section 508 is the federal government's own requirements to itself. However, because they apply to technology that the federal government buys or requests to be built, they often apply to projects funded by the federal government, as well as some states have taken them on as a state requirement. Section 504 and IDEA are education-related statutes. The ADA is, of course, the big umbrella on accessibility, which has now been determined to cover websites. So in theory, all US websites from all US entities could be covered under the ADA as public accommodations. And the big piece of guidelines for making the web accessible is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. They're a comprehensive set of guidelines that cover all aspects of disability and ensure that anything you build is accessible with assistive technology. And there's lots of supporting documents, how-tos, technical advice. That's all part of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines universe. So what do we mean when we say something needs to be accessible? We mean it needs to be used by anyone in any manner. However, we also like to make sure you know that any accessibility features you add to your materials are likely to be useful to a wide range of people in the concept known as universal design. When you create captions, they're not just for people who are deaf, they're for everyone who's in a place where they can't hear or can't hear well, and so on. So think about all of the tips we give you and how they fit into your portfolio of useful design, not only for people with disabilities. Specifically, people with disabilities use digital materials often through assistive technology. And assistive technology is any kind of a device that helps a person to use the mainstream technology, or sometimes it's a piece of special technology separate. Most complicated and perhaps most mystifying is the screen reader, which is the tool used by a blind person. It reads aloud, not really from the screen, but from the code behind your web page or your digital document. So coding up your documents correctly will support screen reader users. In addition, people with low vision may use a screen magnifier that makes the screen really big, but it also provides some control features to help when you're moving around something that's been enlarged really huge. Braille display devices translate the text from the screen reader to something someone can feel with a Braille display with their fingers. There are a lot of alternate input mechanisms used by people with various kinds of physical disabilities, and they all mostly sum up to a person is using a keyboard. It's just not a keyboard that's shaped the same way, so it might be a head pointer or a laser pointer or an alternate kind of keyboard. But if your interface can work from the keyboard, then you can take care of those users. And then there's some specialized educational products like read aloud, highlighting, magnification, and scaling, and so on. So assistive technology relies on your website or your digital document being coded properly. And as a result, it's important to use assistive technology to test your documents and sites to make sure that they read properly. Some people will be better with their assistive technology than others, but in all cases, the main point is to make your materials the best you can to support all the users who want to use them. So we hope to give you a general approach to accessibility. I'll give you a little bit of a lead in, and then Brian's going to walk you through some important questions. So as you approach accessibility, it's okay to think that 100% accessibility is not realistic. It's a wonderful goal, and it's always what we're shooting towards, but it isn't always something that we achieve. What we are hoping you'll be able to achieve is a usable design. You want to make your materials as usable and as accessible as possible. And that means being broadly accessible so that everyone who approaches your site can use it in their own way. You probably won't have any idea when someone who has a disability uses your materials or even attends a presentation you're offering, because not everybody with a disability will reveal that to you or make it clear. And of course, because people without disabilities can also use these features, they're well worth the any investment in learning how to make them part of your design process. So now I'll pass this over to Brian with some more details.
Thanks, Madeline. We have a series of questions that you may be wanting to ask, like, when do I do the accessibility stuff? If you're not familiar with creating accessible digital materials or websites or interactives, it's good to know that it should be throughout the design and development process. So from the beginning. It's not a special stage. It's not something to be bolted on at the end, and it's not something to be handed off to the quote unquote accessibility folks once your digital materials are finished. Instead, strive to create a universally designed either website or digital materials, whatever you're building, that incorporate best practices for accessible design from the beginning. One piece of knowledge to promote is that accessibility is not expensive. It might take a little longer the first few times that you're working in an accessible design manner, but it can be expensive if you don't think of it until the end, and then you do have to either rebuild or retrofit some parts of your digital experience that you're building. And since it's better to start with the easy things than wait to get toward that 100% accessible rollout. Always better to offer as much as you can, as early as you can, and then make it better each and every time you develop new materials. And who does the accessibility stuff? Everyone in an organization has a role in helping to advance accessibility, especially when it comes to websites and accessible interactives, accessible materials, content creators, presenters, developers, and designers, everybody in the production process. But even outside of the shop, people who interact and interface with the public or with students can inform about the accessibility features that you are offering, and also find out what special requests folks who use your digital materials may need. At the administrative level, widgets or third-party sources of materials can be vetted and for accessibility to ensure that that they're ready to go once you procure them. And of course, at the top of any organization, mission and funding is critical for any major directive, and accessibility should fit in there as well. How is accessibility determined? For design, there's really two areas that we're looking at specifically. One is visual. Is there sufficient color contrast? Is it readable? Is the layout comprehensible, and the navigation? Can you read through the document? Can you move through the document and find the information in a way that makes sense as the author intended? So those are the visuals, and that's the same for print as it is for digital. When you're looking at digital materials, including websites or other digital documents, structure and markup are very important for two reasons. One, for some tools that everybody can use, such as zoom and scaling, ensuring that will work correctly, but also for a screen reader, so that a person who is blind or visually impaired and using that piece of assistive technology can effectively and efficiently move through a document. And then how do you test for this? There are automated and semi-automated digital tools for testing accessibility, and you can get a grade on how accessible your document or your website is. There's also going into the code and ensuring that the HTML is written properly. But that's only one half of it, because even an entire website can actually get a very good grade through an accessibility checker and not be very usable for someone using some assistive technology. So user testing is absolutely necessary. So it's both halves need to be done for testing. And what do I do? So the basics of accessible design for today's presentation really fall into 4 categories: images, multimedia, structure, and contrast. And we'll go into detail in each one of these as we move along. So for images, the actual, if you are at all familiar with that big set of guidelines that Madeline mentioned, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines for making websites accessible, the first criterion is that every image requires a text alternative so that someone who can't see the image can get the information. So that's every image. So the first question to ask is the image informative or decorative? And that's the one exception. If it's, for example, a blue line that separates 2 columns of text, that blue line does not require a text alternative. You can use code for assistive technology to skip that. Otherwise, every image requires a text alternative, and that's usually inputted in something called the alt attribute in HTML. And there's ways to do that for PowerPoints and for Word documents and PDFs as well. When describing an image, keep it simple and brief. You want to ask yourself, what are the key parts of the image? And that the person to do that job may be the author or the subject matter expert, and maybe not someone down the line in the editorial process. And the reason is that the person who picks the image knows why they're putting it in there. And just for example, 2 pictures of the same flower are going to be described very differently if this is a photography textbook, for example, or a botany textbook. So context is key when you are describing images. Also, always use high quality images that can be scaled up so that people who zoom 200, 300, 400 times have a high quality, not pixelated image that they can see. One type of image you should avoid, and that's images of text as opposed to using actual text. And there's a lot of reasons for this. And in general, this seems to be less than it used to be, but we still see examples of it every single day. And here are the reasons why. Images of text cannot be changed by users with preferences for font color or size using either web browser tools or tools in the application that they're reading your document in. They might not enlarge smoothly. Again, that's a image quality issue. They may not enlarge at all with page zoom. So even just using your web browser's zoom feature, all the actual text will get bigger and an image of text may not. Also, images of text cannot be read aloud. They can't be translated by an automated translator, and they can't be copied for pasting into another document for easier reading. So for all of those reasons, please avoid images of text. And moving into multimedia, videos and audios and audio for the most part. The 2 aspects you want to keep in mind at all times with multimedia is ensuring that the audio, the information in the audio is available for someone who can't hear it, and the information provided in the visuals of the multimedia are described so that someone who can't see it can get that information. And those can be provided in a number of ways. So captions, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with, is synchronized text that appears on the screen. of the words that are being said. Those can either be open so that everyone always sees them, or the other option is closed, which really means you offer an option to toggle the captions on and off. Transcripts are a really good and, but not so much of a good or. And what I mean by that is captions are, when you're reading captions as the video is happening, you're engaged with the video, you can see the captions. The transcript, very difficult to follow if you're reading alongside, but it is immensely helpful both after the fact and for other uses. So for audio descriptions, if you're not familiar with audio descriptions, this is a separate track of audio narration that describes the key visual elements of a video. And this can either be, as I said, a separate track, or if you're creating a video from scratch, it's always best to have the visual elements described within the natural soundtrack by the narrator, not leaving anything out, so you don't have to create a separate track. But if you do, that's also better, like the captions and transcription separation. Some people will provide a description transcript, and that can work for a very short video. If you have maybe a 30-second or a 1-minute video that is fairly simple, you can describe in advance in text next to the video, or provide that so someone will know what's happening in the video and then listen to the video. That works. But as you can imagine, the longer the video, the more complex the image is. If it's a how-to video or something like that, that's not going to work as well as a synchronized audio description, as you could imagine. And next, I will hand it over to Claire.
Thank you. Okay, so moving into sort of the next category of things to think about is structure. So as you're developing content, it's really important to make sure you're thinking about what the structure of the document is. And a lot of these may be really important things to keep in mind, either if you're the person writing the content, putting it together into a document, sending it out, but also if you are someone who may be putting something together to hand off to a developer, making sure that this sort of information is clearly figured out so the developer can then take those steps to make sure that the document is made accessible and follows kind of the interaction plan that you want. So thinking about, as you go through, what text on your document is a heading? What is sort of the heading level 1, the most important piece of context? What headings might be heading levels 2, 3, 4? There might be more subheadings. So making sure those are marked up, because some people who use screen readers may navigate entirely using, may navigate a document using headings. So making sure that there's clear heading markups so that they can easily move around the document. And then that structure is built in and not just sort of a stylized font change. Thinking about what content belongs in a list. When content is coded up accessibly to be in a list, a screen reader will read it much cleaner than if it's just sort of designed to look like it's in a list. If you're creating a table, are the column and row headers, if they're important to be marked and navigated with, are they properly identified? Is the table going to be sortable? Is there going to be certain columns that you want people to be able to interact with? These are all things that will require additional accessibility work to go in, so making sure that you're thinking about as you go. And then, can link text be understood out of context? In general, trying to avoid any sort of text like click here or read more, especially if there's multiple of them on one page, as it can be confusing and unclear. What are you clicking? What is this click here associated to? What is this read more associated with? So is the link clearly understandable, that you know, if you just hear the text of what's underlined in that link, you'll know where you're going and what sort of content you'll be receiving. It's important to think about the design for the user interface throughout all of this. So thinking through, what is the content going to be navigated with a keyboard? This is a really easy thing to sort of test on your own. Can you, if you just press the tab button on your website, on the platform that you're using, are links, buttons, tabs, or any sort of things that someone would click on, is there a little circle or ring around it that then when you press enter, something changes on the screen? This will be sort of a first layer of accessibility testing that can make sure that someone who's using a keyboard to navigate and can't use a mouse, and also will likely increase the chances that someone who is using a screen reader can access this information. And making sure that that visible keyboard focus, this may be a time to think about designing a focus that's not the browser default, the sort of thin dotted line or light blue ring that may be difficult for some people with certain visual impairments to see against the background. Is there a design that works with the color scheme of what you're working on that may enable you to make sure that that ring is accessible against all backgrounds? And that at every stage along this way, as you're designing things, working with developers, working with some of the people who may be putting some of the code in, just to make sure that at every stage along this way, the structure and the content are working together to be accessible. The next sort of section is with color contrast. So when in print formats, the Standards for Accessible Design in the ADA has in the past recommended a brightness differential of 70% between the text and the background. This is especially more for things like signs or other things that you really want to make sure there's really strong contrast between them. But generally, especially on print media, when you're not able to change the contrast, you're not able to change the font size or color that you would be able to do on a website, making sure that there's as much contrast as possible is really important. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines recommend a minimum contrast of 3.1 for large text, so that is text that's 18 points and larger, or bold and 14 points and larger, and 4.5 to 1 for regular text. So sort of checking this as you're thinking through your color palette, as you're thinking through color choices to make sure that those are met. And if you're using WCAG 2.1, those require that non-text objects, so visible keyboard focus, outlines on boxes, content like that also has a minimum content ratio of 3 to 1. So when thinking about color contrast, it's important to think not just what it is against a background that's really easy to test. For instance, your black text against a white background is a very easy thing to confirm that the contrast is, but as we sort of talked about earlier, text on images can be really difficult. Even in cases like this, where it may be selectable text, so not an image of text, but still just up against an image, it can be really challenging for people with certain visual impairments to read that text. So you'll see two different examples here. On the left, we've just got a picture of the ocean with the text "blue ocean waves crash" and some smaller text. And on the right, that same image has sort of had a black scrim applied a little bit over it. So you'll see that the contrast is a lot greater on the picture on the right because there's sort of a darker background with the white text. And then if we run through a tool, so this is a tool called the Color Contrast Analyzer. It is a web browser extension that you can add that can sort of check the color contrast of text up against an image where you want to make sure that there's a lot of different colors that's difficult to test than it would be if it was just a solid color. And when it's checking up against the background, you'll see on the left side that there's almost no white sort of dots around all of the text, which means that the ratio between that background that's right next to the pixel and the text of the pixel doesn't have enough contrast. On the right side, there's a lot more. You can pretty much fully read the blue ocean waves crash because there's enough contrast. You'll see that even in this case, there's still places where there isn't quite enough contrast. So even though it looks a lot better, someone may still struggle a little bit with this. So thinking about whenever you're putting text on top of an image, really making it as clear as you can and figuring out if it's really necessary for that text to be on the image. Is it clearer for it to be placed elsewhere? And continuing to make sure that that accessibility is there. When also thinking about color, it's important to not just think about the contrast of the color itself, but also the use of color as a way of indicating information. So when in UI design, you want to make sure that selected and unselected objects are clearly different. So for instance, if you hover over a button, oftentimes the color contrast will change a little bit. When you've got a piece of text that's selected, the color might change. And it's important to also make sure that the color contrast is different there. So often you'll see buttons that may reverse color, add an outline. In addition, you're going to want to make sure there's code behind the scenes that's also conveying this information to someone who can't see the screen at all. But as you're picking your colors, thinking about ways to make sure that someone knows that they've selected a button, that the state of something, without just having color there visible or relying solely on color. In forms, you want to really try to avoid using any sort of color to indicate field states. So for instance, is there an error in this form? Sometimes we'll see forms that they might turn a piece of text red to indicate that there's an error there. If you only are using that, someone with certain visual impairments may not be able to know that there's an error with their form. So finding other ways to provide information of which fields are required, which fields have errors, which fields are correct. So you often see like a check marks and X box or other ways of indicating that don't just rely on color. When you're creating any sorts of charts and graphs, you want to make sure you're providing additional differentiators. So that might be a bar graph that instead of just a key in the corner that says red belongs to this line, red means this, blue means this, that you've got those lines themselves labeled. It might be adding in that the dotted line means one thing versus the solid color line, that there's patterns, other ways of providing multiple modes of that information being conveyed, so someone who's colorblind, someone with a certain visual impairment can differentiate what each piece of data means. And whenever you're using links in body text, you want to make sure that they are clearly visible. The most sort of obvious way that's been done is if you think about like Wikipedia, that's just got the very different, you've got black text for body text and blue text with an underline for link text. Using underlines in a different color to indicate that something is a link so that someone can easily find it and click on it and know that they're going somewhere with that. Important to also think about font and text designs. So a lot of the accessibility guidelines do not go into sort of requirements for font size, for font specification. So some of these are just sort of recommendations from different places. And it's important to note that for all of these, with accessibility, just because something is technically accessible does not mean it is accessible for everyone. So whenever possible, by creating content that people can change the font, can change the color, can change the size, you're going to increase the accessibility for everyone. So often sans serif fonts are regarded as having easiest readability. That's not true for everyone. It's not true for all disabilities. Any sort of stylized fonts, so cursives, italics, all uppercase, extra thin fonts, those are especially more challenging for people to read, especially when they're in smaller size. And if you're using any sort of things like italics or uppercase to indicate something important, someone who's using a screen reader may not be able to get that information. So making sure that there's additional ways of noting when you're changing a style to convey information. Unofficially, the US Department of Health and Human Services has recommended Times New Roman, Verdana, Arial, Tahoma, Helvetica, and Calibri as accessible fonts. Obviously, there are other fonts that people have found that are really accessible. These are just sort of some of the suggestions from them. And when you're creating web materials, it's generally recommended to use relative units such as EM and percentages over absolute units such as pixels. This is because a lot of web browsers, if you were changing just the increasing the font of just the page, not zooming in and increasing everything, but just increasing the font size. Web browsers sometimes struggled with increasing the font sizes of absolute units. Most of them now are able to do that, but you still may have people who are unable to do that. So by using relative units on web materials, that increases the accessibility there. And in general, for print material, a minimum of 12 to 14 point font, whenever possible, will increase the accessibility. Additionally, thinking about having your font be left justified instead of center or right. This is because if the sort of where the line starts is constantly changing, it may be more and more challenging for someone with certain cognitive disabilities or learning disabilities to track the information. It's also for this a reason important to avoid any sort of hyphenating words when they go off, when they're too long to fit sort of on the line you have right now. Then this can make it hard for someone with a disability to track that information and figure out what the word is. Using white space whenever possible to separate out content, to sort of give visual cues, breaks, not clustering a lot of text together that may make it challenging to read. And trying to use margins of around 1 inch. This is because often text that's more than 6 inches long can become more and more challenging for someone to track across the screen. When it comes to your print materials, thinking about a material that's going to minimize glare, so a matte or uncoated finish versus a glossy finish that may cause more reflection and make the text harder to read. Think about the paper color whenever you're doing this. So a bright white is going to be harder for someone with certain visual impairments to read. then a warmer white. Avoid any sort of brightly colored papers. So again, think about the contrast of the text up against the paper, and that may make challenging for people to read. When you're printing on both sides of the paper, trying to make sure that text isn't bleeding through to the other side. So if there's a slightly thicker paper, that won't bleed through and make it challenging to read the content. Overall, whenever you're sort of creating handouts for a meeting or event, often having a set of large print copies, knowing where there's access to electronic copies, that if someone can't use the hard copy you have, that they can access it, that you know where to find that so they can pull it up on their own device. And when creating any sorts of flyers or pamphlets, really simple folded patterns. People probably aren't creating origami pamphlets, but really thinking that through, that something that may be challenging for someone with either certain cognitive disabilities or certain physical disabilities to open up that information, get access to it. If there's a lot of stuff going on that may make it difficult to track the information. So thinking about how to make any sort of things that fold or may not have a traditional page reading style as accessible as possible. We have a number of resources here. I'm not going to go through all of them. You'll be able to pull this up and we'll be sending it out afterwards. But there is a lot of really great information out there. The government has put out a couple of really great stuff, the Smithsonian through Health and Human Services. The UK government has a really great do's and don'ts guide that's been going around for a couple of years that covers a number of disabilities and some really good tips on sort of do's and don'ts in creating your accessible content. There's a lot of really good stuff out there. So we'll send out these links afterwards as well. We'll turn this over to Madeline. Are there any questions?
Yeah, so we're ready to start taking questions, and there are some in the chat already. So let's go back and look at some of them. So we have a question from early on, and Brian, maybe you can help with this one. Christina asks, I understand how captions would be used when dubbing, but when doing subtitles, what is the accessibility guideline? Or are the subtitles enough without the captions?
Good question. So I think it would be helpful to know a little more about the what you're actually producing and the context. So captions are slightly different in that they include, for example, sound effects and information about music. So that someone who cannot hear this the soundtrack is aware of those types of things, whereas a subtitle is obviously translating the language that's happening. So they're similar, but the captions are specifically written and slightly different in order to provide access for someone who is deaf or hard of hearing.
Let's see, what's our next question? We've got a link to the color contrast analyzer in the chat if anyone's looking for that right away, and we'll be sending out a resource list afterwards as well. Joan comments that a lot of sites have been using gray font instead of black, and that it often doesn't have enough contrast. And we agree. We actually even see people using gray on gray, so light gray text on a darker gray background, and it's a current trend that unfortunately is highly inaccessible. With grays, you're crossing the line into poor contrast pretty easily. So on the other hand, there are some cases where a dark gray is a little easier on the eyes than a strong black. Some users do prefer a little less contrast, which is one of the things that makes accessibility so exciting, is sometimes people have different needs. And so some users may prefer a slightly lighter text against the white background, or even a creamier background with black text. And that's one of the reasons that we encourage you to make all of your text real text and flexible so that people can adapt it as they need. Genevieve asked if underlined text is difficult to read, and I gave some short replies in the comments, but if anyone else has any thoughts on that. I would say that if you've got a long paragraph that's entirely underlined, that would probably be harder to read. In short places for emphasis, it's fine. And of course, when you're indicating where your links are, the underlines are pretty standard and accessible. If you're considering using underlining for emphasis, I would think about how it fits in your context. If it's a web document, everyone will assume it's a link if you underline it. If this is for print, then yeah, using an underline for short areas of emphasis is fine. Heather asks if there are guidelines for color contrast for people with Erlands, and I don't know the answer to that. Has either of you come across that?
Yes. So in general, the general recommendations for that is that pure black against pure white is harder to read. So that's another case, like you were talking earlier, Madeline, that someone may prefer a little bit less contrast, so a little bit lighter of a black, which is again a case that having your documents be things that people can change the font color will enable them to sort of get it set exactly as they need it.
Great. Are there some other questions? What other design challenges are you facing where you're wondering how to improve your accessibility? Let's see, what is there some, here's a question. Do screen readers or screen enhancers reduce the requirement of a minimum sized font? So screen readers are for people who often can't see at all, though some people who use them may have some vision. Screen enhancers or screen magnifiers will zoom up a text for a user for whom they're too small, but the problem is that not everybody has their tools with them all the time, or a person might be using another computer. There are also a lot of people who don't consider themselves to have a disability, but who struggle to read small print. None of us are getting any younger. And so as we age, many of us find that the small print gets smaller and smaller and fuzzier. So it's important to use those minimum font sizes in all cases to make sure that you're providing a universally usable experience. Someone asks about the tool for adding captions to a video that we mentioned at the last session. And yes, we have a terrific tool available from NCAM. It's free and it's called Cadet. Brian, do you want to talk a little bit about Cadet?
Sure. It is a tool that is browser-based, meaning that you download it onto your computer, and you don't need an internet connection to use it if the media that you have is available locally to you. However, if you're working on something that's already posted, you can just paste the URL into Cadet and create captions from there. So what you're doing is creating a caption file that then has to be married to the video, depending on whatever platform you're showing the video in. So that's another step. And we have a series of how-to videos. I think there might be 10 of them. They're very short and to the point for any process you want to, any process in creating captions you might need. But in short, it enables you to create a caption file from scratch for a video, meaning time, text, captions, and then export into whatever caption format you require. It also is a very nice format for editing captions that you may have gotten either from, say you have a transcript already created, or you have automated captions that were created on YouTube or another platform that have inaccuracies in them or need the timing cleaned up. And it's a very nice editing environment for that. Also, you can create an audio description script, and that is a useful thing to do with Cadet as well. And there's a presentation mode. Say you're in a classroom and you have a video that you want to show, and you didn't have time to produce a separate described script or a separate described version of the film. You can write your descriptions, and it will actually use voice synthesis to speak out the descriptions as you're playing the video. But that's actually can only be done sort of with everyone around your technology at that point. So it's quite a powerful tool. And again, it's free. So download it and try it out.
Corey asked if Cadet works with live streamed videos, and the answer is no. Cadet is for captioning post-production, that is after a video has been made. There are technologies for providing live captions during live events when you're streaming, and so you can certainly look into solutions. It depends a little bit on which streaming platform you're using, how the captioning gets plugged in, but most of the major platforms have a way of providing live captions. And if you have questions about that, please do fill out the survey form, and we'd be happy to talk with you about it more. Heather asked if for things like math equations, it's better to use real text or set it as an image that can be described correctly. Math is a really special case. Math on the web for a long time couldn't be presented accurately or clearly except in images, and so that's the most common way. MathML has gotten better supported, and so now in some cases you can use math markup to put your math on the online. In all cases, you do need to be concerned about the accessibility of that math, because users need to hear math in a way that is unambiguous and clear. And there are guidelines out there for how to write text to describe a piece of math that make it unambiguous and clear. So there's resources for math accessibility that can help with that specifically. If you've got the capability to support MathML, then that's a great way to go, because it will be able to be read directly by users with their tools, as long as they have their tools set up properly. Did we miss anything else? Let's see. Susan asked if for video audio, there's a preferred initial decibel level, or do the computer aids adjust the audio level for the user? So users can adjust their audio just like you would when a video is a little too quiet for you. It's probably a good idea to start out with a nice, clear volume that most people would appreciate, and assume that as long as people don't have to yank their volume to, if a standard user with standard hearing doesn't need to crank their volume all the way up to high in order to hear your video, then that leaves room for a user who does have a hearing impairment to be able to raise their volume. I don't know if there's a specific recommended decibel level though. Anybody else got a clue?
No, I don't.
Merritt asks if there are guidelines for making 3D virtual reality environments accessible. 3D environments are really tricky, and they definitely require case-by-case analysis. We talked a little bit about this on Tuesday. One thing that you should be able to do in your VR environment is make it keyboard accessible. So make sure you're including keyboard navigation commands, as well as anything that can be done with a mouse. It may take longer, or be a little less precise doing it with a keyboard, and so you need to adapt for that in your activities. But in general, do consider trying to make all of your 3D virtual reality interactive stuff fully accessible to someone who's using a keyboard, as long as they can see the screen. For users who can't see or can't see well, it's a lot trickier, because you may have a lot of different resources embedded in that 3D, and it isn't sort of a linear description process where you can just give each object a name the way you can on a standard web interface. But depending what the goals of the activity are and how complicated they are, it's certainly worth considering whether you think it can be easily conveyed non-visually. However, you might find in the end that you need to think about, if this is for a learning activity where everyone needs to be able to use the materials, you may need to think about whether there's an alternative way to teach the same learning objectives for that most complicated VR activity. And someone asked if there are guidelines for online interactives. And for that reason that they're each so different, they're tricky, but yes, there are. There are guidelines for accessible games, and there are guidelines for accessible interactivity online, and we can provide some of those in the resources after the session. If you're working on online interactivities and you'd like to talk to us about them directly and you're from one of the SciAct projects, we would love to talk to you. And because it's it tends to need, the access resources for those tend to need to be customized to the activity itself. It might be fun to get together and talk about it and see what you're working on and whether we think we can give you some good suggestions. Are there any more questions? One topic that comes up a lot, and it's useful for math as well as for other kinds of educational content, is what do you do if you need to describe something more carefully than you can fit in just the alternative text field? Alternative text for images on the web is generally expected to be reasonably short, a sentence or two, and some images simply need more detail. And so for that, you would use something that's sometimes called a long description. And there's a number of ways to implement long descriptions into your HTML. The most common right now uses an attribute called aria described by, where the described by attribute points out to a piece of text elsewhere that gives a fuller accessible explanation of the image. So for example, if you've got a bar chart with data in it, if it's a big enough chart that you don't want to just use words to list out the values, you might want to give a data table. This is particularly important, obviously, for bigger charts with more data. So a data table can be placed elsewhere on the page, either visible to everyone or using CSS to make it not visible to everyone. And then aria described by can point the users to that data table where they can get the same set of data that was used to produce the graph. Other examples might be complicated visual explainers, like if you've got, kind of an infographic or a detailed chart of options where you need to give paragraphs of explanation, or maybe it would be best expressed in a bulleted list. Alt text can't take bulleted lists or any other HTML markup. That can only take plain text. So when you've got a list and you need to put it in the alternative text, then you can use aria described by for that as well. Tim has provided the game accessibility guidelines in the chat, and that's definitely one of the recommendations we would give too as a resource on interactive accessibility, since it's often used in games. Heather asks, if an image is immediately followed by text that describes it, should the image be marked as decorative? And yes, that's a great big yes. There's a very common design pattern where there's an image and then a headline or text that links to another page. And the image is there to be a decorative anchor for visual users to lead them to that same place that the text link takes them. In cases like that, where the text immediately following serves the same purpose as the image, you can hide that image. And if the image is active, it's clickable, there's some code techniques for making the image and the link be a single link, so that users don't have to tab through twice to every object. You can imagine a page full of choices, and if you have to hit every choice on the page twice to get to the one you want to get to, it gets a little tedious. So we highly recommend using strategies to hide redundant images so that they are not separate links from the text that follows them. And even if they're not a link, you can still obviously hide the image as decorative. It's just a little easier even. These are some great questions. We're so glad that you're here.
Okay, it looks like we're letting you go 5 minutes early today, but thank you so much for coming, and I agree, fabulous questions. All of these questions, we've been working, as I said, with NCAM for going into our 5th year now, so everything from making our interactives and games accessible to the long descriptions, training our writers. They've been really helpful. So I encourage any of you who would like more information to request a follow-up session so you can talk about your specific needs. Yeah, thank you again for coming. Thank you to Madeline, Claire, and Brian for being here today. And if there is need for more webinars from NCAM, we are happy to provide those as well. So let us know. All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you, everyone. And look in the chat for the survey link Ethan's posted. Let us know if there's topics you need to learn more about, and if you would like one of the one-on-one sessions through the BUAC project.
Have a great afternoon, everyone.